Hey guys, this is G17, and today we're going to be going over my in-depth review / discussion of the UAC Sear hammer and the trigger bar for the Tokyo Marui Glock 17. And this video will primarily address the fitment, the function, along with my goods and bads about the UAC parts. So let's get right into the review. So the UAC hammer and the Sear comes in a package, and it retails for about 200 Hong Kong dollars, which is around 30 US dollars. While the UAC trigger bar, which is the shiny part over here, that retails for only about 100 Hong Kong dollars, which is around 15 US dollars, give or take a couple of dollars depending on where you buy it. The price shouldn't vary too much. And since these parts have been on the market for a long time, availability should not be a problem. First, for the hammer and Sear, we'll basically be doing a super close-up of these parts and doing a comparison to the stock Marui parts. So first off, these UAC hammer and Sear, we'll talk about the trigger bar later. These two parts are made of steel with a little bit of CNC marks on them. Can you actually see that there's CNC marks? You can actually clearly see the size of the mill head they were using to make these areas. I can tell you right now that these CNC marks do not seem to impede function. They don't seem to affect the movement of these parts. So I can tell you that even though they're quite visible, it's honestly not a big deal. I actually purposely angled my light so that you guys can see it clearly. I can also tell you that the finishing on these are pretty good. They're perfectly fine. They stay on quite well. After a bit of usage, there is some silver marks showing up. Now these parts are for my backup Glock, so I don't shoot my backup Glock as often as I normally do, because normally I'm carrying another Glock. Yes, I carry 2 Glocks in my games. I'm a weird person. But anyways, just letting you guys know that I haven't been using this a lot, but I do have a couple of pistols with these parts, and I do use them sometimes. So this is just me showing you guys some basic usage. That's the reason why there's some wear over there. There's also a little bit of wear near the hammer notch area. This is the area where it locks in like so, but as it moves like this area grinds up against the Sear. So that's the reason why there's a bit of wear over here. Now, as for the silver part, I actually fouled this out myself. I'll explain what this does to your Glock later on in the video. When I look at the hammer, I'll explain what that is later on. So first, let's do a visual comparison of the Sear, and we'll have a quick chat about it. So right here, this is the UAC one, of course. This is the Marui one. Can you see the shape is virtually identical? There's almost no noticeable difference. It's very difficult to notice differences. There are only 2 differences that I think are worth noting. First difference is the area that locks the hammer. Can you actually see that the UAC one is slightly smaller? So in theory, it should let go of the hammer a little bit earlier. It should also lock with the hammer relatively quickly, is because this area is pressed up against the hammer as it approaches. So therefore it should lock and let go a little bit earlier. It doesn't necessarily mean that it locks easier. Okay, that's a completely different story. It just means that it probably locks a little bit easier, like a little bit earlier than usual. It doesn't mean it locks easier. But basically you can see that there's quite a big visual difference in the size of the area that locks. As for the next difference, is the Sear nub. Can you actually see that there is a difference in the slope? The Sear nub size is generally the same, so that's perfectly normal. But the slope at the bottom right corner is different. Now, the UAC slope, this slope here, basically what it does is that it makes your trigger pull slightly lighter. If you don't understand why, excuse me, the nub and the trigger bar here, this is the UAC trigger bar, the nub and the trigger bar works by leverage. So you need enough leverage for you to move the Sear, in order to move it like this, to let go of the hammer. But you can't have so much leverage that it creates a heavy trigger pull, which is the reason why if you buy a AIP or an AKA Sear, you have a very, very heavy trigger pull. The reason is because the AIP and AKA Sear has like a rectangular Sear nub. This is more of a rectangle, but with a shaved off corner. So that's the reason why the trigger pull on this is slightly lighter. At the same time though, you cannot have too little leverage on this, or otherwise your trigger bar will do this. it'll just slip right under it due to the lack of leverage. And you might not be able to pull your trigger at all, so your Glock won't even work. UAC basically figured out a slope for the Sear that makes it work, requires very little leverage in order to move it. I can also tell you that if you have a harder hammer spring will make your trigger pull slightly heavier. I can still find that you can still use the Sear and it will still work even if you have a harder hammer spring. Now, that being said, in Hong Kong we don't use super hard hammer springs, so I can't quite comment on that, but in general it seems to work perfectly fine. Next up is the hammer. The shape is virtually identical, there's not much difference, and by the way, just so that you know right now, the UAC hammer, you can fit the Action 8mm ball bearing rod perfectly fine. Notice how easy it comes on and off. It'll also fit the stock Murray rotor. Okay, so that's perfectly fine over there. And the only difference in these two hammers is the locking area. Now, it's very important that you remember this, because the difference over here is so different that it actually creates a effect whenever you use your Glock. Can you see that there's a difference in the size of this area? That locks your hammer. Can you actually see that there's quite a big difference? The size of this area is really big. By the way, this is a good thing, because that means that whenever this starts to wear out, normally what happens is that sometimes your Sear can have a hard time locking the hammer. Since the UAC one has such a large area, this should be very reliable in the long term. Furthermore, this is made of steel, so it should work very well in terms of reliability. I will talk more about the effects about this later on in the video, is because instead of talking about it, I can actually show you the effects. So we'll just talk about that later on. Just know that this longer area for the locking point is quite noticeably different, and it does do something to the Glock, which I will explain shortly. Now, as for the top over here, the UAC hammer does also feature the same hammer bump. This is called the hammer bump over here. And just to add some extra information, this hammer bump will actually contact your blowback housing unit. If you use your Tokyo Murray Glock for long enough, or your WE Glock for long enough, you may notice that this top part of your hammer, by the way, the rotor goes over here. You may notice that the top part of this hammer will have a little bit of silver showing up. And the reason why is because your blowback housing unit actually hits this hammer bump. So in my case, since the UAC one has the same hammer bump as the stock Murray one, I decided to remove that hammer bump. You do not have to do it, but I advise you to do it because it makes it slightly easier for your blowback housing unit to go over it. Because the only thing that your blowback housing unit touches is your hammer rotor, the valve rocker disconnector, and the trigger bar. If you keep this hammer bump, you add another contact point. So that's the reason why I remove it. And by the way, if you don't believe what I'm talking about, Guns Modify actually designed their hammer based on that prom. Can you actually see that there is a big difference in the hammer bump? There's a big difference. They purposely reduced the size of this hump to avoid the blowback housing unit hitting it. So that's the reason why the Guns Modify hammer allows the slide to return very quickly. Is because with the zero rotor and with a significantly reduced hammer hump, that allows the blowback housing unit to go over it very quickly. That's the reason why this bump is so much smaller compared to these two. Oops, these parts are so small on my hands. Anyways. And lastly, we have the UAC trigger bar. Now first, I want to get this out of the way. Right now, this trigger, if you guys are really big fans of Glock, you may notice that I have a ridged trigger. Can you see these ridges? And then this, on my right hand, is the Glock Murray trigger. Big difference, sort of. Okay, I'm just letting you guys know that if you try to copy what I do in this video, don't try to buy this trigger, because this trigger requires a bit of fitment in order for you to install it on your Tokyo Marui Glock or on a WE Glock, because this does not fit. You will have to modify this or modify your chassis. So just letting you know, do not buy this trigger unless you know what you're doing, because this can actually lock up your trigger and prevent it from resetting properly, and it will also sometimes interfere with your slide release, because this area right over here allows for your slide release to sit. It will actually jam it up sometimes. So be very, very careful. Don't do everything that I'm doing in this video, because I skip over some of the fitments for all my other parts. Anyways, just letting you guys know, back to the main point, the UAC trigger bar, very, very nice finish. Almost like a mirror finish. Can you actually see how shiny that is? It is done very, very nicely. In fact, UAC probably makes one of the best coating for the trigger bars. Like, they do a very, very good job. However, this trigger bar has a special feature that's very, very unusual. If you compare this to other trigger bars, the angle, this is a Guns modified titanium coated trigger bar. Can you notice that the area for the hole is slightly off? I'm putting them practically on top of each other, and can you see that the hole is actually completely off the area? The angle at the front of the trigger bar is very, very different. This gives the UAC trigger bar a very, very special feature, which we will talk about shortly, and this feature will sometimes make people abandon this trigger bar. I'm very well aware that some people have been having problems with this trigger bar and selling them off, thinking that they do not work. I will clarify the reason in my function and effects explanation, which is I'm about to show you the part. So for this first Glock here, I have the UAC hammer and sear only, and the only other part that I modified is the stock Tokyo Marui hammer spring. I modified for it to be slightly heavier, is because this is for a customer. He just wanted to install these parts, and he wanted me to fit his slide properly. So this is actually a great example to show you what the UAC hammer and the sear does to a completely stock Tokyo Marui Glock. So let me first show you how the trigger breaks and everything. So the very first thing is that everything functions very, very normally. If you will notice and look very, very carefully, that's the take up on the trigger. Very, very normal. Exactly the same as a Marui Glock. And break, as well as a similar reset. Okay, this behavior is very, very normal for a Glock. It looks absolutely normal. Now here's the weird part. If you look very, very closely on top, actually on the bottom, on this bottom side over here, can you actually see me moving the sear? Did you see that movement there just now? Do you notice that I'm pulling the trigger? I just moved the sear, and yet the hammer did not fall until I pull the trigger a little bit more, and then it breaks. Now the effect that you just saw just now is this. Watch very, very closely. This is the wall of the trigger. Now I just moved the trigger a little bit, but yet the hammer did not fall. And now the hammer fell. So whenever you use the UAC parts, the hammer and the sear, on your stock Glock, you will have a slightly slippery sear. The reason for that is because of that large area that locks in with the sear, it will gradually slip off the hammer until it lets go. That's the reason why there's a bit of extra movement on the trigger when you're trying to break your shot. But may I point out that this is actually very, very difficult to detect. When I first got this, it took quite a long time for me to notice this effect. If I did not tell you, you probably might not have noticed this. But it's a very, very minor thing. Some people consider this to be a problem. Be quite honest with you, it's just way too small to be a problem. Alright guys, so we're going to do the exact same test as we did before, but this time I'll add the UAC trigger bar. Now, this is where the special thing comes in, so watch very, very closely as to what happens. But first, I'll assemble everything in front of you, because some people are curious about what I put in my Glock. This is everything in my Glock right now. Everything is stock, except for the UAC sear, hammer, rotor, and the trigger bar. as well as the ridged trigger. I really like this trigger. None of you guys probably care about it, but I like it a lot. Anyways, those are the only parts that I swapped out. Otherwise, there's nothing special about this Glock. Okay, so I'm just gonna show you this all on camera. Okay, so that's my lowered assembled. Now here's the special effects that I wanted to show you guys. Now, so back then, on this is the original one I showed you guys earlier. This is the breaking point. And this is the reset. Very, very normal. On the Glock I just assembled, this is what it looks like now. That's the wall. Okay, this is the wall. So the wall is much farther forward now. Oh, whoops. Now, this is the wall. Breaking point. And this is the reset. So notice that the breaking point and the reset point is now very, very far forward. Now, but I will say that the breaking of the trigger is very, very clean and very, very crisp. Much crisper than it was on that one. This one, on the other one, it was a slippery break. This one is a very, very crisp break. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Doesn't this make the trigger worse? Well, be quite honest with you, this is entirely personal preference. Do you like the fact that this trigger breaks that far forward? Do you like the fact that it resets that far forward? It's honestly a personal preference. I can tell you that these UAC parts work. They do in fact work. However, they don't exactly create effect that everyone likes. I'm very well aware that people have been selling them because they don't like the effect. I would keep it just because it's quite interesting. I personally have a couple of Glocks set up that way because I find the effects to be just very, very interesting and quite interesting to shoot. So up to this point in the video, you guys should be aware of what the UAC parts do to your Glock, and you may be somewhat aware of what the trigger bar specifically does with the UAC parts and what happens when you don't use a UAC trigger bar, which I also showed you what happens. And now I will explain the fitment associated with fitting it onto a Murray Glock and fitting it onto a WE Glock. I will skip all the other Glocks, like an Army one, because, well, they're not very, very common. Stark Arms does not apply either, because Stark Arms uses a completely different system. It uses like a copy of the Tokyo Marui Glock 18 system, but slightly modified. But it's at the same time, it's not technically a Glock 18 system. Anyways, I digress. Back to the main point. So, let's talk about Marui first. My very, very first fitment point for a Marui is that the pins that go into the hammer and the sear will be slightly tight. In fact, when people install it into their hammer assembly, some people have complained that they are so tight that they could not install them. For the greater part, I will tell you right now that I have been able to install every single UAC part without a problem. I will admit though, that they are quite tight. In fact, when I bought UAC Glock 18 parts, they were also a little bit tight on the pin. So it appears to be a common thing with the UAC parts. It's not so tight that you can't fit them in. It's just inconvenient. I advise you, if you wish to install those pins a little bit easier, you can always just take out the hammer and the pin and just work your way through it, and basically loosen the tolerances by hand. The other way you can do it is by using sandpaper. Honestly, just pick whatever method you guys want. And another additional personal advice is that do not weave the pins through the hammer. Do not weave the pins into the hammer assembly by using a hammer. You do not need this to install those pins. Do not under any circumstances take a hammer and start hammering stuff. You do not need one. The only time where you should be using a hammer is to punch out that pin and to punch out this rear hammer assembly pin. Otherwise, do everything else by hand, because you do not need to start taking a hammer and whacking stuff. That's just a bit extreme. My second fitment note, and you guys are somewhat aware of this, is the hammer bump over here. Now, can you actually see that the hammer bump is actually below the chassis point. That's the reason why I do that hammer bump mod, is because it reduces it up to the point where the blow-by housing unit does not touch it. That's the reason why I do that modification. Otherwise, there are no other fitment points for the Murray. Honestly, you do not need to do this. Do this if you want. I primarily do this when I'm fitting metal slides, is because this just completely eliminates the possibility of another contact point. So that's the reason why I do it. Otherwise, there are no other fitment notes. So for my third fitment point, this is not really a fitment problem or anything like that. This has more to do with a compatibility problem. So the third problem, or the third compatibility problem, has to do with tunable triggers. Now, first, normally when people get a tunable trigger, they are normally looking to remove the take-up. Normally, the Glock trigger has a lot of take-up, and a tunable trigger basically removes all that take-up. Now, a lot of people in the airsoft Glock world, what they do is that they like to buy these kind of triggers and then do their own custom sear work and do their own custom hammer work, so you can get a very, very lightweight trigger pull with a very, very crisp break, as well as a very, very crisp reset. Notice that you can both hear and feel it. You might be able to hear this in camera because it's actually quite loud. That's what a lot of people like to do with their triggers. That's the reason why tunable triggers are so popular. Now, if you decide to use a tunable trigger with a UAC Glock, with a UAC trigger bar and sear and hammer, because of how far forward the wall is, the only take-up that you can remove is this. That's the only take-up that you can remove. So basically, when you buy a tunable trigger with a UAC trigger bar as well as the sear and the hammer, it's virtually useless because it only removes that little take-up. That's the reason why when people buy UAC parts, I don't advise you to buy a tunable trigger, because it's sort of pointless. There's so little take-up since the breaking point is so far forward. So basically, you won't be able to make full advantage of the tunable trigger. You can use it, but you cannot crank the tunable trigger all the way up high like this one. Can you actually see that the trigger on idle, it actually sits a little bit farther back than usual? Okay, you cannot have that effect. You cannot do that trigger work. It's just because of the way that UAC designed their parts. That's the reason why I advise you not to use the tunable triggers. You can, but sort of pointless. So next up, let's talk a little bit about WEs. Now, WEs in general, like conceptually, a WE Glock 17 or a HK3P Glock 17 is almost exactly the same as a Murray. The only difference is the dimensions and the quality of the parts. That's virtually it. For example, a WE Glock has a smaller sear nub and a slightly different trigger bar. And some of the parts are also different. The sear also uses an open sear, which is the reason why on a WE, the rotor on the WE sits a little bit higher than the Murray. This is not a WE. I don't have a WE handy to show you right now. So, the fitment points in WE. If you decide to get a WE Glock and use UAC parts, I advise you to use the UAC sear, hammer, and the trigger bar as well. All three parts simultaneously. The reason why that is because the WE trigger bar is not so good. The WE trigger bar actually has that area that can wear out very easily. The area on the UAC trigger WE trigger bar is a little bit wider. This area, which is this hook area, on the WE trigger bar is a little bit wider. The reason why it's wider is because the WE sear nub is smaller. In fact, if you look at this Murray sear, focus. The WE sear is like half of this size. The sear nub of a WE is half of the size pretty much. So that's the reason why a WE trigger bar needs a slightly bigger area over here to have more leverage. Again, we talked about this leverage part earlier. That's the reason why for a WE, I advise you to also get the UAC trigger bar and the UAC sear and the hammer all together. The WE trigger bar will work at first, but it will not work for long. Furthermore, as just some extra information for you guys, I advise you to not use the garter trigger bar with a UAC sear. The reason why is because a garter trigger bar, just like a WE trigger bar, has a very wide area. This area, this hook over here, it's very tall. And what that basically does is that if you decide to use those kinds of trigger bars with a UAC Sear, remember the UAC Sear nub is almost the same size as the stock Tokyo Marui one. So basically what happens is that your trigger bar, the garter trigger bar, will actually hold onto the Sear. And because it holds onto it and doesn't disconnect properly, you have a full auto issue. That's the reason why a garter trigger bar, sometimes you'll get a full auto issue if you use it. That's the reason why. It's because this hook over here on the garter is a bit too thick. That's the reason why it doesn't lock, it holds the Sear for a very long time. That's the reason why I do not advise you to use a garter trigger bar. Can you fit a garter trigger bar to a UAC Sear? The answer is yes. But it's annoying as hell. You might as well just buy a UAC trigger bar. So that's the reason why. You can always learn the hard way if you want to, like I am. You can always do that if you want. In fact, I encourage people to learn the hard way, because you learn a lot from it. But if you want your life to be a little bit easier, simply just get the UAC parts with the UAC, because they work. You guys already know that on a Marui, a Marui trigger bar will work with the UAC Sear. I'm just telling you that the WE is a special case, that's all. And that's pretty much all the fitment problems for WE. The pins are still a little bit tight, but otherwise, not a very big problem, to tell the truth. So that's officially the end of my video. I'm sorry for making the video so long, but basically I just wanted to make this to permanently address some questions that a lot of people tend to ask me on Facebook. Because I've answered the same question like 1,500 million times by now. So hopefully this video will sort of be here in the long term. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. And please let me know if I happen to miss out on anything, or if you have any questions about these UAC parts. And just let me know if you have anything else to add, because I am sort of interested to see what other things that people notice, because I've only used this for a limited amount of time. Although I carry the UAC Glock out to the game, I don't always use it. So that's the reason why I'm making this video anyways, just to show you guys what's up, just to let you know my situation with it, and let you guys decide. So anyways, thanks for watching, peace guys, happy shooting.